Now, 12 years ago, Kenya's political system, previously regarded as one of the most stable in Africa, stood on the brink of collapse. A disputed election combined with simmering ethnic tension was the proximate cause, and it led to violence that left at least 92 people dead. Comparing the US to Kenya may seem like a stretch. One is a superpower and an established democracy. The other, an equatorial republic in a supposedly coup-riddled continent. Yet, it is notable how often Americans have taken to questioning their own republic's solidity. As Mr. Biden said last week, we've learned again that democracy is precious and democracy is fragile. That's true of all countries everywhere. However, because of the United States' persistent sense of innate superiority, there is little obvious talk of the need for fundamental reforms. One can't help but wonder what would happen if the US undertook the same sort of self-examination that Kenya and much of Africa have attempted over the decades. Joining us now is Kenyan Patrick Gathara, a strategic communications consultant. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
Yes, it's fascinating that you make that comparison between the United States and Kenya, the journey of Kenya. And again, let's start with the first point or the last point that you quoted, or Biden was quoted as saying that democracy is fragile and democracy is precious. Does that then help us understand that when we look to democracy, we're looking at a journey rather than a finished article?
Yes, I think the democracy is always a journey. It's never that you get to an end point. I think it's always a system that needs to be improved. And I think in the case of the US, the problem has been the assumption that they had perfected, if you will, the democracy, and so could go around teaching it to others. In as much as they have helped countries around the world deal with the problems, they helped Kenya with its reforming its system. It seems they have not really looked internally and fixed the problems that they have with their own system. In fact, it's really ironic that lots of the reforms that they ask other countries to undertake, whether it's to have a common electoral rule, whether it is to have one election management body, these are things that the US itself does not have, and it needs to look at its own system and ask what it can do better rather than really focusing on the outside world.
Now, Patrick, it's interesting. You said you watched the US election, what transpired, of course, in the capital, and the number of deaths, that you witnessed in the Kenyan election 12 years ago, where 92 people died. And you talked about parallels between what you saw in the US and what you witnessed in your own country, Kenya. What are these parallels that you are talking about?
Well, first, just a quick correction. It wasn't 92 deaths. It was actually over 1,000. It's about 1,300 deaths that happened in Kenya in 2008. But in terms of parallels, I'm the first to admit that it is not the case that the US was like Kenya. You didn't have 1,300 deaths there, you had only 6. But still, you see a disputed election. You see violence after the election. You see that dispute is really down to incredible electoral systems. Systems that people don't trust. I don't mean that they're not necessarily delivering the correct result, but they're not seen as legitimate. And I think that these are the sorts of things that you need to be serious about reforming, because an election is not simply about who wins, but it's whether the people who lose actually accept that loss. And for as long as we are in a situation where the people who lose can feel that they've been disenfranchised, it's good to remember that this is the third election that the US has had, presidential election, that has been disputed or that has left big numbers of people feeling like they were robbed. So you remember the 2000 election with between George Bush and Al Gore.
Yeah.
The 2016 election, and now this one. That's 3 elections out of 5 that tells you you've got a problem. And I think that what they need to do is to introspect. This is not a victory for democracy as Joe Biden tried to paint it. And even in the way that the election was quote unquote protected, it came down to individual choices by individual officials who could have chosen something different. People forget that.
Yeah, Patrick.
Yes.
When you said that it's not about who wins, but the process. Yeah, very important indeed. But when you watch what happened, particularly let's talk about the president, across the board, even the courts, said the election was free and fair. So it's not really a question of the people who are not accepting the results, not because of the process, but because they didn't just want to accept the result, because they didn't feel that they should have lost in the first instance.
Well, I think that's a really dangerous assumption to take, or presumption. I think that when you look at the electoral system and you've got half of your electorate unhappy, it doesn't matter really that you disagree with them. These are the people who can cause you problems. And if you've got such huge numbers feeling disaffected, you end up with a situation where you ask, is our electoral system delivering not just a president, but is it delivering the legitimacy? And if it is not delivering legitimacy, you can't just start saying that people have to accept the results. You've got to figure out, how do we fix that? How do we ensure that people can believe what the election officials tell them?
Patrick, I have to, well, I don't have to, but I'd like to interject at this point. And just to buttress what my colleague was just saying, I think the world over, most people accepted that it was a free and fair election. And even within America, you get that sense that some of those who disputed it were disputing it for political reasons, not because it wasn't free and fair. And also, the evidence goes towards the fact that Joe Biden won with quite a significant number. You can't dispute the people who voted for Joe Biden either, just because you're trying to regard those who voted against him. I just want to raise the point, because you wrote, just to paraphrase what you're saying, that some of the comparisons you drew between Kenya and America was that it was not so much about establishing who won, but about the underlying and systemic problems. So maybe we should go towards that, because disputing the elections is one thing. That's to one side. The other issues are maybe what led to people feeling that they could hold the country hostage when they lost an election. So what are those fundamental underlying systemic problems that you feel should be addressed?
Well, the fact is, if you look at the U.S. System, classifying this as a free and fair election can be quite problematic. We know it is a very seriously gerrymandered system. It does not really represent the result does not represent the will of the people, because the way districts are drawn, the way people are allowed to vote, etc., is problematic. Voter suppression is a huge issue there. If that happened here in Kenya, we would call it what it is. We would call it election rigging. This is an election being stolen. And I think that we need to start calling that. Don't call it a free and fair election. It is not. It might be true that on the day Biden won, and I completely accept that. But that is very different from saying that everybody who should have voted, all votes were counted, etc. That's not the same thing.
But you can't have,
so
Patrick, there's never a time really that you're going to have everybody who should vote. When these things are called, when they are called free and fair,
problem which disenfranchises people, so populations in the US are consistently, for example, minorities are consistently marginalized. If you look at the representation of the vote, so if you look at how the Senate is constructed and you compare that with how people voted, it's not the same. Republicans end up with much more seats than they deserve. This is not a free and fair system. It is a rigged, gerrymandered system. And we've got to understand that, so that then we can ask, how do you fix it?
Okay, and that's where I'm going to now.
We maintain the myth that somehow it's it's a perfect election, then they will never actually sit down and fix it, which is kind of the point of my article.
All right, Patrick, let's talk about this. You referred to it. Can I refer to it? What Biden called the fragility of democracies around the world. He alluded to this. What must we continue to do for democracy, not just about, because these are parallels between America and Africa, to make sure that democracy doesn't break into pieces because of the fragility?
Right. What we need to do is to continue the process of perfecting democracies. We are all on the same path. Some are ahead more than others, but it doesn't mean that they have arrived. And that's the thing, I think, for me, what struck me most about the discussions that went on after the election is that there was, the discussion on reforming the system was entirely missing. Donald Trump is a result, is a consequence of a failed US system, a system that showed it has problems containing the president, holding him accountable, for 4 years. But you don't hear them saying, let us reform this imperial presidency we have. If it happened in Kenya, that would be the discussion. But that comes from us.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. It's a very engaging conversation. I wish we had more time. Thank you for the time you did give us.